And now we're thrilled to welcome Nadia Hashimi to the show. Nadia is a pediatrician turned novelist who draws on her Afghan culture to craft internationally best-selling books for adults as well as young readers. Her novels span generations and continents, taking on themes like forced migration, conflict, poverty, misogyny, colonialism, and addiction. She enjoys conversations with readers of all ages in libraries, book festivals, classrooms, and living rooms. With translations in 17 languages, she's connected with readers around the world. Nadia, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me.
It's very nice to have you here, and thanks for joining us. Afghanistan has a long history of occupation and insurgency. The recent news is, of course, the withdrawal of American troops after being there for 20 years and the takeover of the country by the Taliban. In my opinion, this kind of American war, and here I'm thinking of Afghanistan and Iraq, these post 9/11 wars. Iraq, I was a reporter in Iraq, is a travesty, and a lot of American writing about it, and movies have been a sort of failed to represent what actually occurred there. Your work, on the other hand, resists a lot of these sort of stereotypes I think these movies fall into. Your newest novel, Sparks Like Stars, begins in April 1978 at the start of the Saur Revolution, a coup that set off a decades-long struggle for power. Since our topic today is bullshit saviors, could you discuss some of the civil conflicts that eventually led to the American invasion, and also talk about why you chose to put the beginning of your novel during the Saur Revolution for those of our listeners who might not be familiar with it?
Sure. And, I chose the Saur Revolution because I felt like that was a representation, that event was a representation of the actual triggers of what led Afghanistan into what would become then decades of war. And, I grew up like anyone else. I was raised in the United States. I was born and raised here. So I grew up on these American crafted stories, narratives around the situation in Afghanistan. And so I was consuming what was available for public consumption. And that was basically, Rambo pounding through the countryside on horseback to fight alongside these Mujahideen freedom fighters against the evil communists, of Soviet soldiers then retreating, and the celebration of Afghan warriors bringing this Red Army to its knees, and this being their Vietnam. And then there was, the post 9/11 news, where all of a sudden we were seeing on, in papers and in different images, these burqa-clad women who were being beaten by the Taliban. And, we were honing in on these events without any context or without any connective tissue. And I could see in book clubs that I have been lucky enough to participate in around my other stories that there were a lot of gaps in the understanding of Afghanistan's history.
Can I just say, it is so incredibly troubling and such a gigantic example of what a fuck up we have done reporting on this, that in all the years that we've been in Afghanistan, have never heard the term Saur Revolution. Now, I mean, I reported on Iraq. I know a fair amount about Iraq history. I never was in Afghanistan and write about it, but still, come on.
Right. I think we actually skip over the Saur Revolution because it doesn't fit with the narrative, right? The narrative was, oh my God, the Russians invaded Afghanistan. And then here comes the savior moment of, well, let's go in and we can save them, right? So that's why we were funding the freedom fighters and all of that. And so that's what I wanted to go back to. I wanted to go back to that moment because of two reasons. One, because I wanted to showcase to people the peaceful, beautiful, kind of idyllic Kabul that I inherited from my parents and their stories and their family members. And then also to be able to get at, like I said, what was the etiology of this war, of this conflict that went on and on. And it's not as simple as the Soviet Union invading. There has to be an acknowledgement of the US's strategic presence and engagement in Afghanistan.
So in Sparks Like Stars, we hear your characters talking about how foreigners talk about and to them, which is I love hearing that little bit of fictional gossip as they consider how to position themselves in relation to these people who want so much power there. Historically, American propaganda has portrayed US imperialism in countries such as Afghanistan as acts of justice and salvation, as you've already mentioned. And these narratives are bullshit. So how do you think, what specific mistakes are typical American narratives about Afghanistan getting wrong? Like, what mistakes are American writers making as they tell these stories, and what consequences does that have?
So there are a bunch of mistakes. I would say number one, it might seem superficial, but it's important to start with, is the Afghan people are called Afghans, not Afghanis. And I thank you all for getting it right. But then we move on to
Americans learn how to say that every 5 years or so when there's a big story, and then they just go ahead and forget it. That's fine.
I don't really blame people. I think that of all the things that are happening, that's the least egregious. But I'm here to remind you, right? The second is that this Islamic or jihadist movement that had arisen in Afghanistan was spontaneous, and that we had absolutely nothing to do with it. But it's pretty well documented in books that if you care to read them, that the CIA had funded programs and enabled the creation of these militia groups. One of the things that I find really fascinating is in the late 1980s, the United States started spending millions, to the tune of like $50 million through USAID, then via the University of Nebraska in Omaha, to produce school books in Dari and Pashto for Afghan children that were called like the alphabet for jihad literacy. And so like G is for gun, J is for jihad kind of thing. And then these were smuggled into Afghanistan through the Pakistan's military intelligence, the ISI. That's a big one. The next one I'd say is the idea that women's rights are they just don't jive with Afghan culture. It's limited to the cities only. Afghan women have been making steady progress. Women's rights are always the early casualties of any instability, of any war. And, women in Afghanistan had the right to vote before their counterparts in the United States. What would have happened if Afghanistan had not been destabilized? Well, we will never know, right? And then lastly, I would say is this idea that Afghanistan is the graveyard of empires. To an extent that may be true. I understand the idea behind it, but it kind of makes it sound like the empires were the only ones who died in Afghanistan. Afghanistan has lost so many Afghans to these wars, to these imperial conquests. And it's been, honestly, the location of proxy wars, whereas the empires have gone on to survive and to persist, but Afghanistan has continued to suffer.
I wonder if you could read to us a little bit from your book.
Absolutely. All right, so Sparks Like Stars is, we've mentioned that it begins in the Saur Revolution. So that's April of 1978, and there's a military coup. The rumblings on the ground are basically there's a push and pull between the communist movement and then the more US friendly. And so the culmination of that is this military revolution. And into this context, I've inserted a fictional girl named Satara. And so she is a witness and survivor of that event. So I'm going to read from the beginning of chapter 6. I dared not peek out from behind the curtain. Hidden from view, I grasped at every possibility that kept my family alive. Surely someone, anyone, was rushing them to a hospital where they would be stitched up and restored. I prayed for white gauze and syringes and the able hands of doctors. But these hopes were flimsy as soap bubbles, especially as voices I did not recognize echoed through the hallways unchallenged. When I was 4 years old, I'd been awakened one night by my mother's shouts. A burglar had crept onto the roof of our Kabul home and sent a vase crashing as he'd slipped into our home through a window. When he fled, my father gave chase, leaping from rooftop to rooftop. He caught the man on the roof of a home 1 block away. At least that's how I remembered it. It was as likely that he'd chased the man down the street as it was that he'd catapulted across the homes of our neighbors while they slept. Regardless, this was my memory of the night, and it became part of how I saw my father. It was the reason I believed my father could and would protect us from any danger. I remember when he walked me to school, I would watch his shadow stretch long ahead of us and believe it was the shape of truth. To me, day or night, Baba was larger than life. That was why I could not comprehend why I'd seen Baba buckle as he had. I expected him to appear in the window at any moment and pull me onto the roof of the building to escape. I peeked at the clock on the wall. After 3 hours of standing, the muscles of my legs burned. Still, I stood as straight as I could, trying to keep my body hidden in the small sanctuary behind the curtain and out of view to anyone looking up from outside. Where was everyone? Why hadn't President Daoud exploded onto the scene with loyal troops to round up the murderers? I listened hard, and eventually heard the boom of President Daoud's voice rise from somewhere deep in the palace. Traitors! I couldn't make out any other words. I felt unmoored and wanted badly to slide down and give myself over to the floor. The moon still glowed bright, but in an hour or so the rising sun would turn the horizon pink. I listened to the movement of boots, the thud of thick soles on fine carpets. I heard orders barked and loud grunts of exertion. I dared not peek. I only looked down at the darkened carpet beneath my feet and waited for the stench of my urine to lead the soldiers to me. They moved up and down the length of the hall, going in and out of rooms. I closed my eyes tight, though what I saw with my eyes shut was more terrifying than what I saw when I kept them open. Footsteps entered the library slowly. I heard a man's breathing, the sharp intake of air through flared nostrils. I was working up the nerve to smash my elbow into the window and take my chances leaping to the ground when the curtain snapped back. I found myself face to face with a soldier, or more precisely, the unblinking eye of a Kalashnikov. I closed my eyes shut and quaked. I do not know how much time passed this way, with my existence dependent on one finger curled against a trigger. At some point, I opened my eyes. The rifle's tip quavered but stayed trained on me. I dared to look past the barrel to the trembling arms that held it up. I saw a man, panting, his red-rimmed eyes bulging. He looked over his shoulder and back at me. He wiped his palm on the thigh of his pants. "You must go," he hissed, nudging my arm with the rifle's barrel. I jolted when the warm metal touched my skin. "Go!" He wiped the sweat from his brow. I whispered a prayer, looking past him at the emptied bedroom across the hall. My eyes fell to the darkened floor. I want to be with them. The soldier went to the doorway, looked down the hall, and then returned to me. He grabbed my arm and walked me out of the library with the end of his rifle pressed between my shoulder blades. I walked, not daring to look at him. I heard footsteps and the murmur of voices coming from the direction of the president's quarters. Milop? I forced my best friend out of my thoughts and focused on taking quiet steps. "You can't hide. There's nowhere to go," he said, his breath hot and rancid in my ear.
Thank you very much. It's really, I'm sorry, I was like totally entranced by the scene. We're recording this in the wake of the Pentagon admitting that the drone strike that they made in Kabul last month killed 10 civilians, among them 7 children, and that it was a, quote, horrible mistake. You were trained as a pediatrician, and you often write from the perspective of children. How do you think about depicting the effects of war on childhood and children, and how does trauma differ between children who've lived their lives in conflict versus those, such as your main character, Sitara, who have escaped?
I think that my approach in my writing, and the reason that I'm drawn to the lives of children, is the same reason that I was drawn to pediatrics. I wanted to go into pediatrics, but because I knew that anything that you could do early on in a life would help dictate the rest of that life. And there's so much longer of a trajectory to have. And, that can go in a positive and a negative direction. This particular drone strike, as horrific as it was, and, I truly see it as President Biden just trying to get the last word in an argument. And unfortunately, 7 children were among the dead. But those are not the only children. The organization Save the Children has estimated that around 33,000 children have died as a direct result of the conflict in Afghanistan. And that's not to say, not to include the ones who have died as secondary causes, the malnutrition, the disease, the poverty, all the problems that flourish when we don't have any kind of stability. And so, what do we have? We have very traumatized children who are growing up to be adults who are traumatized and living with all of that. And the children who are living through that conflict don't necessarily have access to any kind of healing. And they're most likely, exposed to repetitive trauma. And so every day is a constant affirmation that life is a series of traumatic events. It becomes something that they anticipate, and it's imprinted on them. And it really can affect the dynamics within the household as well. And we see that too when soldiers coming home from war and what the impact can be on their family. Now, children like Sitara who have escaped conflict, they may have some distance from the actual event physically, chronologically, whether or not they get access to some kind of healing and trauma-informed care, it depends on their circumstances. And they'll also be facing fresh issues, which I've tried to portray through this story as well, things that I'm seeing in the people around me, things like survivor's guilt and the symptoms and manifestations of post-traumatic stress disorder. Some of the children in the newly arrived that are coming from Afghanistan now that I've had a chance to either interact with or hear from their experiences, they're actually worried about maybe a brother who didn't escape or a father who's still back home. And so it is an ongoing process of healing for everyone.
So in the worst versions of the kind of false narratives we were talking about a little bit earlier, Americans are heroic and virtuous, and the oppressed or the opposition are represented as lacking agency or malicious, either way, exotic, sometimes just vague. And your work focuses, of course, on characters living in Afghanistan, and particularly in this book, and sometimes includes complex depictions also of soldiers or families of warlords. And I think we were thinking here specifically of The Pearl That Broke Its Shell, in which the character Raima is married to a warlord. And a major presence in Sparks Like Stars, I'm avoiding spoilers here, is a soldier, Shire, who plays a role in Sitara's fate. And you went to Afghanistan in 2003. I'm curious to hear you talk a little bit about your depiction of the complexities, the political histories, the agency of Afghan characters like Shire.
You know, it's, readers that I've heard from, they have picked up on, you know, just their own feelings, their own conflicted feelings around characters like Cher, or the one from, you know, the warlord who's in The Pearl That Broke Its Shell, where, you know, they have an overwhelming feeling in one direction, but then there are moments. And, you know, I think that what I try to do through these characters is to give people, you know, impart on people a little bit of what I've seen of Afghanistan directly, either, you know, in the time that I was there, but even more so just in conversations with my family. Within our families, we have people who were on different ends of the political spectrum when they were back home in Afghanistan, people who were in different roles. And so, you know, not everybody who was in one political party is an evil villain. The reductive, you know, I like to say the reductive is seductive, that we want to believe in the good guys and the bad guys, but it's not always that simple. And, you know, some of the images that come to mind right now, and I don't say this to, you know, rationalize or justify or kind of sanitize the Taliban, but, you know, once the Taliban took over on August 15th, we started to see these images coming out on social media, images of these Taliban warriors on a merry-go-round, on paddle boats that are in the shape of like swans on a lake, you know, swinging. They created a swing with rope and were swinging from the wings of an aircraft. I mean, these are people who probably didn't have a childhood. They have spent all this time, you know, fighting. But in that moment, you could see a tiny glimpse of humanity. And that's what I that's what I always find is most interesting, is in that gray area, because I think that's where the most value is, the most learning. The Taliban used to be called, you know, freedom fighters, so they were our friends, and then they were the evil Taliban. And now slowly you hear this narrative being pushed out that the Taliban are aligning with us to help us fight ISIS and help fight this war on terror. So, you know, we have an understanding that psychological manipulation is real, that, you know, you can't really shoot people in the head and expect to end them. You've got to find ways to change their minds. So, you know, that's really what it was. It was a mission to create a little bit of humanity with the purpose of understanding that that's where we need to be working. It's on people's minds.
What was that? Oh, the movie about the guy who helped fund the Mujahideen, somebody's war.
Charlie Wilson's War.
Charlie Wilson's War. God, what a bullshit movie. While we're talking about things that are bullshit saviors, like I see that movie now and I'm like, oh my God, what, who made this? How could this have occurred? I mean, what is it like to watch a movie like that for you? Have you seen it? Do you know the movie?
I've seen it. I think it was, you know, it's interesting. I think what I also draw from that is like, wow, it just takes like a couple people with cocktails to change the direction of a country's future. I mean, change an entire narrative, and that hurts.
And
right?
to get
that
a soundtrack
hurts.
and make it seem really fun.
Yes, because what about everything that had been going on before Charlie Wilson was clued into it, right? Like, why wasn't that important enough to guide our foreign policy and our decisions? But that's just not the way it works. Sometimes it takes celebrity involvement or something else that's flashy in order to get our attention.
Am I right that this is a Tom Hanks flick, isn't it?
It is, and I love Tom Hanks.
That's
I do.
Totally a black mark on Tom Hanks's acting career. Not that I don't love Tom Hanks, so I don't really give a damn about Tom Hanks. Earlier, we discussed how the Saur Revolution prompted a still ongoing. This is me being very negative. I don't even like Tom Hanks. Earlier, we discussed how the Saur Revolution prompted a still ongoing phase of occupation and insurgency, from the Soviets to the Mujahideen to the 93rd Division to individuals such as Amir Dado. Am I saying that right? Is that the right way to say it? Okay. Amir Dado. And of course, the US, Afghanistan. And of course, the US, Afghanistan has witnessed a series of new leaders promising to put an end to bloodshed and establish equilibrium. How does your own writing address these promises or false promises? And how do you, as a writer, resist the bullshit saviors when they come to save a place like Afghanistan?
So I think it's, step one is to acknowledge and recognize the bullshit savior narratives, right? And, for one, so there are certain headlines that come out and talking points that you see, coming out from behind podiums with, a lot of fervor. Like, the United States spent $2.3 million in Afghanistan or on Afghanistan. Okay, so why don't we take one step further and analyze where that money went? And some really great people have done that work, right? We see the vast majority went to companies like Raytheon, Lockheed Martin, Boeing, Northrop Grumman, and General Dynamics. This is the military-industrial complex, right? It's not some boogeyman, it's a real thing. And those companies over the past 20 years have created very, very happy shareholders, right?
You said 2.3 million, but I think you mean a bigger number
trillion.
than that. Yeah.
2.3 trillion. Did I say million? Yeah.
Yeah.
And then the next one is, the US withdrawal. There was a narrative going around that the Afghans didn't fight for their country because of this, precipitous collapse. And then this narrative that the Taliban came in peacefully, despite the guns over their shoulders. But in the past 20 years, we've lost nearly 70,000 Afghan lives, Afghan soldiers, not just civilians. And that is a heavy toll on the country, right? That is a lot of trauma. It's a lot of grief. There's another false narrative that women's rights aren't inherent to the Afghans. Interestingly, Cheryl Bernard, who's been associated with different think tanks, in February of 2019, she had an essay out that just ruffled a lot of Afghan women's feathers. She was basically saying that, well, it's time for the Afghan women to step up and do their part in their fight for their rights. She said it's time for them to put their shoulders to the wheel and, fight for them just as we did. Yes, lean in, right? And then, that's a total affront to the Afghan women who have been doing exactly that, who have been leaning in. The United States didn't save Afghan women. It created favorable conditions for them to continue that struggle, to continue that fight, with an acknowledgement, too, that at times the United States created unfavorable conditions to women's rights. And then, here came this mission accomplished. The US has signed a deal with the Taliban. We're going to end this endless war. And so in February of 2020, which is 1 year from that essay, Cheryl Bernard's husband, Zalmay Khalilzad, the US envoy, signed this deal with the Taliban, which is actually a total and utter capitulation of the United States. And it was a defeat that was disguised as an agreement. And, the release of 5,000 Taliban prisoners who probably did not go on to, become small business owners or anything like that. So what I hope to do through my stories is to, first and foremost, center Afghan lives, center their voices. They are the protagonists. And in these stories, we're going to follow their struggles, their mistakes, their achievements, and whatever they get to in the end, it is because of their efforts with, other people along the way. I think American people are absolutely generous in spirit. They're eager to help. I see that now in the resettlement efforts with, around the newly arrived. But American policy is not really a reflection of the will of the American people, unfortunately.
Man, that's a whole nother episode. So I so appreciate your comments about the way that Afghan women's rights are depicted, their own agency and all of this. And in Sparks Like Stars, your characters also address women's role in the larger political story with some frequency and also with some humor, which I appreciated. And a lot of the conversation in the wake of US troops pulling out of Afghanistan has been about the fate of Afghan women under the Taliban. And there is, of course, valid concern about that. Even the idea, though the idea is, as you've noted, of Americans as saviors is wildly problematic. And there was that recent New Yorker article about Afghan women eager for Americans to leave. I'm curious if you will crystal ball for us a little bit, if you could talk a little bit about how you imagine the future for Afghan women now and your own choices in writing about them going forward.
So it's really hard to have a lot of optimism, to feel really good about what's happening. I think that Afghans and Americans were together in feeling that we had reached a time for the United States to depart Afghanistan, but there were a lot of different ideas about how that would play out. I think because also the United States' continued presence really was just fuel for the Taliban about this, American conquest here and the presence of foreigners. But after the United States announced its withdrawal, what happened in the country was that the Taliban launched a targeted assassination campaign. So women, journalists, activists, university students, these were their targets. And this is continuing on now, that they're targeting these activists, these former government employees, the women who were members of parliament. They're entering homes, they're taking their cars, they're taking any means of security that they may have. NGO offices that have been run by women have been shut down. And again, they've gone in and just confiscated the cars and taken them. What they've done as a policy, now we see that girls are limited to a 6th grade education. They're still allowing women to go to university. So I'm not sure what they think happens between 6th grade and the university, because
in America, we call that homeschooling.
Yeah. So I don't think they've ironed out the details here. And then in some areas, and there really isn't consistency in what's happening across the country. So in some areas, some girls are going to school, maybe they're going to private schools. It's just very inconsistent. And then in some areas, they have separated, right, the genders. And so you've got curtains that are going up. In some places, they've got to be in separate rooms, but separate is not equal. We know that. And especially when there's a shortage of women teachers. So you're not really going to have the teachers present with the students. Women can't go back to work in a lot of places because the Taliban say they have not basically figured out how to work in the presence of women. The women journalists were removed. There were many, many women journalists on air. They were removed. And the Ministry of Women Affairs was erased. And its physical location was taken over by a new, well, not new, it's just the return of the Ministry of Vice and Virtue. That all is on top of the general problems, the financial, pending financial collapse, the banks that are open on and off, people can only withdraw maybe $200. There's inflation, so it's exacerbating the poverty, limitations on healthcare access, and there's just really a lack of productive governance. So it's really hard to feel very good. But I will say that, again, we're relying on the determination and grit of the Afghan women, of the university students that I hear from, of the brothers that I've seen videos of brothers saying that they will not go to school without their sisters. And so the Afghan people themselves, I think you've probably seen some images of women standing up to protest, of Afghan people standing up to protest directly in the face of the Taliban.
Isn't there also a rural-urban issue that's going on here, that the Taliban are Pashtun, that's a smaller group in Afghanistan, that they are also, that they are that group is primarily rural, and so there's a sort of, as there is in America, a rural urban divide.
There absolutely is. And I think that, I don't want to pin the demise or the Taliban movement on any one particular ethnicity, because I think that's another thing that Afghanistan's always been a victim of. It's this ethnic divisions and this tribalism. I think what you see, is that, yes, there are regional differences, but in the cities, you also have areas where people were able to coexist, where they could be peaceful. The Taliban themselves have definitely been guilty of ethnic discrimination. And so certain populations, like the Shiite population, like the Hazara population, they have been victims of the Taliban for sure. And they're, one of the groups that we worry about the most as being at risk.
Okay, so thank you. That was a great answer. I'm sorry, I'm just listening because you're giving us such good information that it's very hard to get in Western press. Your stories emphasize women's agency. And on that note, we can't neglect to mention the work Afghan women are doing to advocate for their own rights. As you mentioned, you're on the board of the Afghan American Foundation and are a member of the U.S. Afghan Women's Council. You mentioned to us that you're doing a lot around evacuations and resettlement. Can you talk to us a little bit about that project?
Sure. And so this isn't something that I was prepared for or, thinking of doing, but all of a sudden everything changed very, very dramatically. And then, on August 15th, we all kind of sank in with this realization that the country had just collapsed. And then it was a moment of like, oh, dear God, what about the people that are there? And we knew because of these campaigns, these targeted assassinations that had been going on, who would be most at risk. And these were the women who had been leading these organizations that were working on justice and peace and the advancement of women's rights and the progress in education. So those of us who had been up until that time together just advocating for Afghan women's rights in general, the involvement of women in the peace talks and advancement of women's voices on the national stage. And these were voices that we had been amplifying from within Afghanistan, right? But all of a sudden, we had to look to evacuate family members, women, journalists, minorities, and people who had worked with the security forces. And understanding that anything that we were doing, was not a standard protocol. We were all figuring it out as we were going along. So people were, literally, I have spreadsheets that I'm holding, that I'm keeping and sharing with different sources in hopes of getting some of these people evacuated. That's what we were doing during that evacuation phase before the United States closed down its operations at the airport. And so it's become, what people call this digital Dunkirk, where we're really trying to organize on these sheets, name, date of birth, location, cell phone numbers, how can we get in touch with these people, what is their risk, and trying to share how at risk some of these people, how vulnerable some of them are, and then also their family members. So it has been, it's been heartbreaking, but it's also just been a moment of, connecting with other people who were doing the same thing. And last week I was actually in a room with a bunch of these people, which was the first time. Well, most of this has been happening, very, very virtually. So what we're hoping to do, what I try to do through the writing is to take what's happening on the ground and try to reframe some of the stories that I think are being portrayed in the wrong way. And, we see women in need of saving. We see women who are meek and broken in Afghanistan. But on the flip side, Afghan women are really funny. They're bold, they're creative, they're persistent. And that's why we've had women in the positions that they have been in now after 20 years of a chance for them to actually climb and succeed. And so that's really it. It's this moment is a demonstration of their humanity and the demonstration of our willingness to stand with them.
Thank you so much. I'm one last question. I'm curious as to how, I've heard other writers say this and I have mixed feelings about it myself, but sort of the notion that when an event, capital E, happens, one needs the distance of a decade or more to kind of think about how one might portray it. And I'm wondering how you imagine fiction writers might write about this troop withdrawal a decade, 2 decades from now, what kind of shadow it will have.
Well, if we look at historical examples, I think there will be one group of writers who will be trying to, again, craft those classic American savior narratives and, glorify the U.S. involvement and maybe hone in on those, archetypal stories where an American soldier is, saving his comrades, his brothers. And I think that there will be another group of writers trying to dismantle all of that and take us past the lies and the misconceptions to dig at the truth and help us learn from it. I'm also really worried because I think that there may be other events that are bigger and more pressing for us to be writing about at that time. Because, what happened in 1978, that revolution, what happened when the United States turned its back on Afghanistan and it was taken over by extremists and became a safe haven for terrorists, we saw what the outcome of that was on US soil. So I don't know, in a decade from now, 2 decades from now, will there be another huge capital E event, as you say, that will consume our attention and, take writers to try to figure out how to process that as well? I don't know.
Nadia, thank you so much for joining us. That was really a fantastically informative conversation, and I want to encourage our readers to go out and pick up Sparks Like Stars and also your other books. We appreciate your joining us.
Thank you so much for the chance to have this conversation.